Previously on Sodor the Early Years.
The bridge is gone!
Surely this wouldn't. If they think it's unsafe, this could be the end of the railway.
Mr. Hart, how do we know the rest of the railway infrastructure is safe?
We've been having less passengers ever since that bridge collapsed a couple of days ago.
Three days after the bridge had collapsed, Thomas was taking on water at Tidman when Eric steamed in from the Kirk Ronan branch.
Morning, Eric.
Hello, Thomas. How are things going on the Little Western?
We're managing to keep up with the schedule, but it's just a few days until Christmas. We're usually quite a bit busier than this.
Thomas said, worried. He looked over at Eric.
But anyway, how are things on your branch line?
Rather quiet. I'm not getting the usual Christmas rush either.
That's what I was afraid of. The passengers think the railway's not safe.
Has the railway ever seen anything like this before?
No, that's why I'm worried.
Thomas replied. A moment later, a guard strode over and climbed into Clarabelle.
Looks like it's time for me to go. See you later, Eric.
See you, Thomas.
Eric replied as Thomas chuffed off. Thomas reached Toltro without any problems. As he pulled into the station, he noticed a goods train waiting, but there was no sign of Duck. He knew the Little Western engine had brought those trucks down. A moment later, a whistle sounded out, and Duck arrived from further down the line.
Where have you been, Duck?
Thomas asked, slightly confused. He knew that the railway inspectors were still examining the collapsed bridge.
I was sent to pick up Charles West and his cameraman,
Duck explained, as the two men in question climbed out of his cab. While the cameraman prepared to film the station, Charles West began talking to the station master.
What brings them here?
They're doing a report on how we're keeping things going for tonight's news.
Thomas smiled slightly.
Sounds hopeful. That should get our passengers back.
There's something else too. Mr. West told me he had a scoop.
Thomas glanced over at the reporter.
A scoop? He doesn't seem to have any sort of machinery on him at all.
No, Thomas. He means a bit of unexpected news. You see, he was interviewing Inspector Davison, who was in charge of the investigation, up at the bridge.
Oh? What did he say?
It was off the record, but it looks like something may have hit the bridge from underneath before it collapsed.
Thomas grinned.
Then it's not the railway's fault, once our passengers hear that.
Exactly. Mr. West will be making a point of that on tonight's news, too.
Thomas's grin grew even wider. Then, another thought struck him.
Didn't you have something similar a few years ago? A double-decker bus or something?
Duck chuckled.
Bulgy, yes. But I don't think this was a double-decker bus. Inspector Davison said it looked like something with a sharp edge, and it was painted bright orange.
Bright orange?
Thomas repeated thoughtfully, as his guard's whistle sounded out. He quickly ran around Annie and Clarabelle, then departed, heading back towards Tidman. Meanwhile, Douglas was waiting to depart Callan with the slow goods. Lorries from 2 or 3 different companies had been brought in to help ferry goods across the break in the track. "Are we ready to go?" Douglas asked. He'd noticed that the workmen seemed to have finished loading his train. "We're just waiting on one more load," replied his driver.
Who's bringing that in?
Asked another voice. Douglas looked over, spotting Mervyn Burns, the director of Sodor Road Freight, watching the loading operation. "I believe it's one of your lorries," replied Douglas's driver. An angry look crossed Burns's face.
I've told them time and time again.
He was interrupted as a horn sounded out, and a Sodor Road Freight lorry pulled into the yard.
"Sorry I'm late,"
he began, before spotting his director standing there.
What have I told you about being late?
There was a traffic jam, sir. An accident.
I'm not interested in excuses, Hugh. You're to make your deliveries on time and not a second later. Don't forget, you can easily be replaced.
I'm not due to leave for another few minutes anyway. If I may say so, he cannot really do anything if the road is blocked, Douglas observed. Burns glared at Douglas.
How I run my company is none of your business.
He declared angrily, then shot a look at Hugh.
I'll deal with you later,
he said, and stormed off. Douglas looked closely at the lorry, who was looking rather downcast. Is he usually like that?
I'm afraid so. We don't even have enough time in our schedules to complete our roads properly. If we're late, well...
Aye, I saw. You didn't have to take that, you know.
What can I do? The managers of the other companies will listen to him. He'll tell them I'm unreliable. My colleagues are all in the same position.
Now listen here, Douglas said firmly. Nobody deserves that sort of treatment, be they human or machine. You just need to stand up to him. When you do, I'll be ready to back you all the way. I'll gladly tell anyone what I've just seen. Hugh looked gratefully at Douglas. Although he didn't think he'd be able to do it, it was a comfort to know that he had support.
Thank you, Douglas.
Alright, Douglas, you're clear to go, called the yardmaster. Right on time. Think about what I've told you, Hugh, Douglas encouraged, as he got his train underway. A short while later, Thomas had completed his run. He was still thinking about what Duck had told him as he shunted Annie and Clarabelle into their siding. He knew what Duck had said about leaving the railway's reputation for the Fat Controller to deal with. But surely, Thomas thought, the best way to help with that would be to find what had caused the bridge to collapse. Once Annie and Clarabelle were in their siding, Thomas chuffed over to the coaling tower. James was taking on coal, and Thomas would have to wait until he was done.
You're in a good mood,
James commented as Thomas came alongside. The tank engine quickly explained what Duck had told him.
We all know we can see fewer passengers than usual. I mean, it's just over a week until Christmas. We should be worked off our wheels.
I know what you mean,
James replied.
So, I thought if we could find this big orange vehicle, it would help the Fat Controller restore the railway's image.
James frowned.
Have you seen a big orange lorry driving around?
Well, no, but...
I mean, my red paint makes me stand out, but an orange lorry would be even more distinctive.
The railway inspector knows what he's talking about, just because we haven't seen one.
James scoffed.
The railway covers most of the island, Thomas. Do you really think that's likely?
Will you two stop arguing?
Sheffield said, as he pulled up next to the other two engines.
You've both got good points. There's got to be some sort of explanation that fits both of them.
And what might that be?
What are you asking me for? Compared to you two, I've only just got here.
It might be worth mentioning it to the other engines,
James said thoughtfully. A moment later, his fireman finished filling his tender, and the red engine chuffed off. Both tank engines watched him go. Hopefully, he would be able to find some answer. James did ask around, asking all the other engines if they'd seen a big orange lorry. He spoke to engines on the main line and on all the branches, but he just kept drawing blanks. No matter who he spoke to, the answer was always negative. Later that evening, Henry and Patrick were resting in the sheds.
Patrick, I've had an idea about that orange lorry James was talking about. The one nobody seems to have seen.
What would that be, Henry?
A few nights ago, my departure with the Flying Kipper was delayed by your container train, having to make an emergency stop. The Yardmaster said something about a damaged container, but I didn't quite get the full story.
Oh, one of the refrigerated containers on my train was damaged, but no one had noticed until I was about to leave. Given the refrigeration unit wasn't working, it had to be taken off.
Henry looked closely at the other engine.
That would have been the night before the bridge collapsed, wouldn't it?
I think so, yes. I remember hearing about it when I reached Tidmouth on the return leg of that run.
Do you recall what colour the damaged container was?
I see what you're getting at, Henry. I'm afraid I couldn't really see the container. It was right at the rear of my train. But I can tell you the damaged refrigeration unit is right on the top of it. That's the standard design.
Is it indeed?
Henry said thoughtfully, and he departed to take his next train. After collecting his coaches, Henry brought his train to the platform at Knapford. He looked along the platform, hoping to see the Fat Controller, but there was no sign of him.
Excuse me, station master.
The station master came running over.
Yes, Henry?
Is the Fat Controller around? There's something important I need to tell him.
I'm afraid he's in a meeting at the moment, Henry. If you'd like to leave a message, I can pass it on to him.
I would appreciate that.
Henry said. Then he explained what Patrick had told him about the damaged container. When he'd finished, Edward looked over from the other platform.
I think you're onto something, Henry. I took that container down to Brendam Docks, to the container depot there for repairs. It was bright horrid.
Henry grinned, relieved.
Then we just need to find who brought it in.
The station master was smiling too. It wasn't just the engines who were worried about the railway's future.
I'll be sure to let Mr. Att know about this,
he said. A moment later, the guard's whistle sounded out, and a very relieved Henry pulled out of the station.
Early the next morning, Hugh and some of the other lorries were waiting at Calne. They were waiting for Douglas to arrive, with some trucks to be taken up to Aylesbury. Looking over, Hugh saw an unfamiliar blue car pull up in front of him. A moment later, a red BMW stopped behind him. 3 men emerged from the cars and joined Hugh.
Hugh, this is Inspector Davison of Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate and Mr. Stephen Topham Hatt. They have a few questions for you,
said Burns.
Hugh looked nervously over at Davison.
What questions would those be, sir?
Our investigation of the bridge showed that it had been struck from underneath by a large orange vehicle.
Go on, sir,
Hugh said. He could see where this was going. My agents heard of this and discovered that an orange shipping container had been damaged the night before the collapse. This container matched the paint found on the bridge and was recorded as being brought in by you from Harwick. You'd have had to pass under that bridge to get to the harbour.
Well, Hugh, what do you have to say for yourself?
That's pretty much it. My driver and I were making the delivery from Harwick. It was late at night. An accident just outside Harwick had delayed us. We'd had to speed to make our tight delivery schedule. It was raining heavily that night, and as we approached the bridge we saw something on the road up ahead. I swerved to avoid it, and the top of the container struck the bridge. And my driver gave the container a quick inspection. We didn't have time to do any more. We didn't think there had been any damage to the bridge. I mean, it was made of stone.
The Fat Controller frowned. Why didn't you come forward when the bridge collapsed?
I was scared, Mr. Hatt. I'd already gotten in enough trouble for nearly missing that delivery.
Surely, if you'd been delayed, your manager would have understood, replied the Fat Controller. Hugh glanced over at his boss, who was shaking his head slightly. I think our controller deserves an answer, Hugh, said Douglas, who'd been observing the conversation. Hugh glanced over, receiving an encouraging smile and a wink from the Scottish engine. A moment later, he realised what Douglas had in mind.
Our schedules are unrealistic, Mr. Hatt. We're given no allowance for delays at all,
Hugh said, with growing confidence. He shot an accusing look at Burns.
That pickup from Harwick should have had an extra half hour in the schedule. We, the lorries and drivers who are out on the roads actually doing the work, have been trying to tell you this, and you just won't listen. Then you'll berate us for being just a few minutes late.
An angry look crossed Burns's face.
How dare you! I've never berated or forced you.
Nay, that's a lie if I ever heard one, Douglas interrupted. The Fat Controller shot a surprised look at the Scottish engine. Douglas? I'm sorry, sir, but I will not stand by while someone's being bullied, Douglas replied. Before the Fat Controller could say any more, Douglas turned an angry glare on Burns. Only yesterday I saw you berating Hugh here for being a few minutes late. Something he couldn't help. due to a traffic jam. It didn't even matter that he was late. We still had a few minutes to load his cargo into my truck before I left. Didn't it cause any delay at all? But the way you were acting, you'd have thought he'd just deliberately run over a person. And then you have the temerity to stand there and call him a liar, when he's just standing up for himself. He's just a bully, when all's said and done. Burns was speechless. He stared at Douglas for a few seconds, before turning to the Fat Controller.
Mr. Hat, are you going to let your engines talk to me like that?
The Fat Controller looked from Burns to Douglas, then back again.
Douglas is one of the most reliable engines on my railway. While he could have been a bit more diplomatic just now, I have no reason to doubt what he says is true.
My driver and fireman can confirm it, sir, as can the workmen who were here at the time.
Thank you, Douglas,
the Fat Controller replied, and he turned to Inspector Davison.
Inspector, in the light of what we've just heard, your investigation may need to be put in the hands of the police.
That was as far as he got. Suddenly, Burns ran for his BMW. He took off, throwing the car into a three-point turn. With a squeal of tyres, he sped off. He zoomed across the tracks, right in front of Oliver.
Driver, quickly. What's happening, sir?
Oliver asked, confused, as the Fat Controller came running up.
To be honest, Oliver, I'm not quite sure, but it strikes me that Mervyn Burns is quite scared of a police investigation,
the Fat Controller observed, thoughtfully. It didn't take long for that reason to become clear. Once the police started looking into Sodor road freight, they quickly found that the company managers had been using it to smuggle contraband between England and the Republic of Ireland. Mervyn Burns was put behind bars, along with the rest of the management team. Charles West did all he could to ensure this story got out, including Sodor road freight's role in the collapse of the bridge. Once this got out, passengers flocked back to the Northwest Railway. Goods customers came back too, and soon the engines found themselves worked off their wheels once more. While this had been going on, the Northwest Railway's workmen had been busy repairing the bridge. Early on the morning of Christmas Eve, the first train rolled over it from the far end of the Little Western. Later that evening, the engines were gathered at the main sheds for the Christmas party. Once they'd all arrived, the Fat Controller climbed up onto a podium to deliver his usual Christmas speech.
Engines, I did have a few words planned, but in the light of recent events, I think there are only 4 that matter. I'm proud of you. You pulled together, doing what was needed to keep the railway running. On top of that, a brilliant piece of detective work by Thomas, James, Patrick and Henry allowed us to uncover the truth. All of this has confirmed what I already knew. I can rely on you, and I couldn't ask for better engines.
A chorus of horns and whistles greeted the Fat Controller's words. They died down after a moment or two, and Gordon spoke up.
Sir, I saw how you handled those reporters at that press conference a few days ago. I just wanted to say, we're proud to have you as our controller, too.
Indeed, sir.
Edward added.
Come on, everyone. 3 cheers for the Fat Controller. Hip hip, hooray, hooray, hooray.
As the air filled with whistles and horns once more, everyone there, both human and engine, knew that the railway's future was assured.